kids. Well, you coming?
Good morning, everybody. This is the TSMU fan here, and today I'm joined by my good friend Train Lover 123 to talk about the Christmas movie, The Polar Express.
What's going on, everybody? This is Train Lover 123, hashtag TrainsRock, and I am so honored to be here with you to discuss one of my all-time Christmas classics. So, what is The Polar Express about?
Well, I'm glad you asked. For those of you who don't know,
Or if you've been living under a rock for your whole life.
or that. Anyway, the movie is about a boy who has doubts about Santa until a magical train picks him up and takes him and other children to the North Pole to meet Santa himself, while also being served hot chocolate and encountering many obstacles along the way.
Wow, that's amazing! Not like I haven't seen it a million times.
So in this video, we'll be talking about what makes the movie such a great one in the first place, how they made it, the history of the real Polar Express, and some Easter eggs and trivia that you probably missed.
And with that all out of the way, let's get the show on the road, shall we? Now, if you'll excuse me, I got a train to the North Pole to catch.
This is the Polar Express.
We can't talk about the Polar Express without discussing its basis, everyone's favorite Berkshire.
No, not that one. Close, but not quite. There you go. The Pierre Marquette 1225. It's
It's a Baldwin 284 S3 class Berkshire type steam locomotive built in 1931.
It's a Lima Locomotive Works N1 Class 284 Berkshire type steam locomotive, which was built in October 1941.
Guess the know-it-all boy doesn't know as much as he thinks he does. Speaking of that, the company that became the Lima Locomotive Works began as the Lima Agricultural Works in 1869. This would make Lima one of the largest locomotive builders during the heyday of steam. An order for 15 Berkshire locomotives was placed with Lima in the spring of 1937. The arrival of these locomotives must have come as a welcome relief to everyone involved with the Pierre Marquette, since the Great Depression had not been so kind to them.
These engines were bigger, stronger, and faster than any other locomotive the railroad had ever owned, and they immediately went into freight service along the Pierre Marquette's main trunk lines from Chicago, Grand Rapids to Detroit, and between Saginaw and Toledo. Pierre Marquette had the 1225 in regular service from 1941. However, the merger with the Chesapeake and Ohio in 1947 saw a change in its duties. It would remain in use on C&O's Michigan lines until 1951. The time of war saw a huge boom in traffic, though soon after the end of World War II, diesels began to arrive and the days of steam were numbered.
Although they had been built to last 50 years, the 39 locomotives of the Pierre Marquette's 3 Berkshire classes were retired after only 7 to 14 years of service. Through the 1950s, most were sitting abandoned and rusting away in isolated yards in western Michigan, waiting for their inevitable fate. As the 1950s dawned, the fate of 1225 seemed inevitable. 1225 and her sisters were valued at about $15,000 each for scrap metal, and a post-war America was eager as to what the steel could be used for and what it would be made into.
The story about how 1225 survived another day is quite interesting. According to Michigan State University Railroad Club member David Jones in his 1989 Trains article, The Spartan Locomotive, C&O Railway President Cyrus Eaton contacted Forrest Akers, the vice president of the Dodge Motor Division, in 1957. Eaton was disappointed that the relatively new Berkshires were being sent for scrap, and he made a suggestion to Akers that one of the engines be given to MSU's engineering department as a teaching tool. While University President John Hanna was not very enthusiastic about the idea, Akers was one of the university's biggest donors, and Hanna was not about to argue with that. So the last engine in line, 1225, was pulled out of the deadline at New Buffalo and was fixed up, complete with new Chesapeake and Ohio lettering on her tender, and later towed to East Lansing. On June 6, 1957, Pierre Marquette 1225 was put on display just south of the Spartan Stadium. Maintenance was fairly kept to a minimum on her outdoor display, however it did receive an aluminum cover for its tender and an occasional paint job when needed, which was funded by a $600 budget provided by Hanna. Sadly, the rest of the Berkshires were scrapped by 1962, with her sister, Pure Marquette 1223 being the only other survivor.
After her dedication, 1225 lay dormant and slowly deteriorated. During its stay, someone tried to light a fire in her firebox. As a result, the MSU reacted by removing all the grates and welding the firebox door half open. They also put a locked steel door in the engine's cab with a fence built around it. The gate was only open during college football weekends for public tours. It was during this time that a young Chris Van Allsburg saw her for the first time. As a child, he attended every home football game at Michigan State, where the 1225 was on static display. He recalled playing on the engine many times.
I remember that train on campus,
he said.
I can't believe it's the same train. I climbed on that train. I actually stood on it.
1225 remained here at this spot until a group of college kids came together with the notion of getting her running again to carry their fellow students to Michigan State away games every year. With the help of a few retired railroaders, hard work, and perseverance, the vision eventually turned into a reality. And since then, Pure Marquette 1225 has been running on the main line at her new home in Owasso. But wait!
Wait!
What about Chris Van Allsburg's encounter with the engine, you might ask? Well, let's book a ticket to catch our train for the next chapter.
Never do that again.
I couldn't resist. Seeing the 1225 on static display at Michigan State was a big inspiration for Chris Van Allsburg, and in 1985, which also happened to be the same year 1225 returned to Steam, The Polar Express was published. The book is now widely considered to be a classic Christmas story for young children. It was praised for its detailed illustrations combined with a calm, relaxing storyline. For the work, Chris won the annual Caldecott Medal for illustration of an American children's picture book in 1986, the second medal received after the publication of Jumanji. By 1989, over 1 million copies had been sold, more each year than the last. The book had made the bestseller list 4 years in a row. Additionally, based on a 2007 online poll, the National Education Association listed the book as one of its teachers' top 100 books for children, and was one of the top 100 picture books of all time in the 2012 poll by School Library Journal. It was inspired in part by memories of visiting the Herpelsheimer's and Wurzburg's department stores as a child, and at the premiere of the film, Chris stated that Pure Marquette 1225 was the inspiration for the storyline. He was inspired by the number 1225, which to him was 1225. Christmas Day. The plot of the book remains relatively the same as the movie, however, one notable difference with the book and the film is that everything about the hero boy not believing in Santa is completely missing. There's also the lack of any obstacles that the train encounters along the way, and Hero Boy's sister Sarah only appears at the end of the story rather than the beginning and ending in the film. Hero Boy also climbs aboard the train without hesitation in the book, whereas in the film, he has his doubts before gaining the courage to get on board. Another interesting thing to note about the book is the Polar Express itself, which doesn't look anything like it does in the movie. In the movie, it more accurately resembles 1225, which is of course the engine's basis as we mentioned earlier. And the new characters in the film, like Hero Girl, Billy, the Know-It-All Boy, the Hobo, and Smokey and Steamer, aren't present in the book at all. However, some characters in the film were inspired by background characters that appeared in the book. For example, this kid in the hot chocolate scene with the glasses and the yellow clothes is most likely the inspiration for the Know-It-All Boy, and this girl sitting next to Hero Boy at the end when the train departs the North Pole is the inspiration for Hero Girl. There's actually not really much more to talk about regarding the book since it's so similar to the movie, so let's go over some trivia about it. Chris Van Allsburg considers the Polar Express to be the easiest of his picture books to write, citing there only being one draft with few changes from the final version. For his illustrations, Chris got inspiration from German painter Caspar David Friedrich, who is known for panoramic landscapes featuring silhouetted figures. He thought Friedrich's paintings had a gloomy feeling, which he matched in his illustrations using brown and violet colors.
This is the 7th book written by Chris Van Allsburg and the 2nd book after Jumanji to be both adapted into a film and win a Caldecott Medal for U.S. Picture Book Illustration. Another cool detail of the book is Fritz the dog, an Easter egg that appeared in all of his books. It appears as a puppet on Hero Boy's bedpost in the first illustration in this book. This appearance was carried over to the film adaptation. Additionally, a picture of Babe Ruth, a professional baseball player, can be seen on the wall in the boy's bedroom next to the window. This picture is also seen in the film. Also, contrary to its basis, the locomotive in the book has a 4-8-2 wheel arrangement, which means it inaccurately has 2 trailing wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 4 pilot wheels, while the locomotive in the movie has a 2-8-4 wheel arrangement, which means there are 2 pilot wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels under the cab.
And a partridge in a pear tree.
Silence, peasant!
Sorry, I had to. Now that we're finished talking about the book, let's take a look and see how it fared when it was adapted for the silver screen. All aboard! After the massive success of the Polar Express book, it seemed fitting that it would eventually receive a movie adaptation. I mean, Jumanji already got one in 1995 with Robin Williams in it. And sure enough, actor Tom Hanks, a veteran of such Robert Zemeckis productions as Forrest Gump and Castaway, pitched to adapt the book in 1999 with hopes of playing the conductor in Santa Claus after reading the book to his children. Interestingly enough, Chris Van Allsburg was hesitant to sell the rights to his book for a film adaptation, but after learning of Hanks' involvement, he changed his mind, noting that Hanks showed a particular sensitivity to the material. However, before Zemeckis was slated to direct the film, Rob Reiner, who directed The Princess Bride, was expected to direct it first. Reiner, while never directing Hanks before, had starred opposite him before in Sleepless in Seattle. Reiner's company, Castle Rock Entertainment, subsequently made a 7-figure commitment to co-produce the film with Hanks' company Playtone, Chris, and William Teitler, Chris's partner at Golden Mean Productions, in March 2000. This is a great property, and we are excited about being back in business with Tom and Playtone, said Castle Rock President Martin Schaefer. We will be meeting writers soon and intend to put this on a fast track. It's a great book, one that Tom has always loved. Rob Reiner was hired as the director, and Hanks at that point was only planning to play the conductor. At this point in production, the film was originally scheduled to be released in December 2001, but after the film was repeatedly postponed, Zemeckis was hired to replace Reiner as director and co-producer in February 2002. While Reiner has no official credit in the film, Castle Rock still served as one of the film's production companies. The film was common territory for Zemeckis. Many of his films, from Back to the Future to Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Contact, had visited strange worlds and along the way bent the old space-time continuum. However, the director wasn't sure how to approach Van Allsburg's little book. How would he do it? What was the story about, really? Then things started to ferment in my mind, and I realized the book was actually the perfect outline for a movie, Zemeckis recalled. The story was very linear, very clear. Kids can take it literally as this journey to find Santa Claus, while older readers can understand it as a metaphor for much bigger ideas. It deals with symbols of Christmas, but at its core is a universal story about belief in things you don't completely see or understand. During the first meetings held in Zemeckis' Image Movers production office at Universal Studios, the director asked a roundtable of production principals their personal feelings about the book. They found themselves referencing the Wizard of Oz as an archetype, with Dorothy and her friend's journey along the yellow brick road echoed in the magical train trip where the boy embarks on a grand adventure while making new friends along the way, and each learns an important and personal lesson. One creative approach was the decision to draw upon the childhood memories of Chris Van Allsburg and Robert Zemeckis, both of whom had grown up in the Midwest. Robert Zemeckis said that at the beginning, the art department went out in search of Chris Van Allsburg. The director had a hunch about what they'd find. Sure enough, Zemeckis recalled, the art department explained that the very house where Chris Van Allsburg grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan was similar to the one depicted in the book. The Polar Express itself is also similar to the kind of electric train set that everybody who was a kid in the 1950s and early 1960s might have had under their Christmas tree. Even Chris's vision of an industrial North Pole recalled Detroit, which he had visited as a boy. The story was all resonating from a Midwestern, Middle American Christmas memory. Zemeckis, who grew up in the 1950s on the south side of Chicago, had the same Midwestern roots and memories. Before production began on the Polar Express, the director had celebrated his 50th birthday with family and friends on a bus tour of his childhood neighborhood, which struck a serendipitous spark in production designer Rick Carter and producer Steve Starkey. And this is when they decided to use both of their childhood memories as inspiration. We as filmmakers have all done movies where we reference aspects of our own lives, which we bring to a production which personalizes it, Carter said. To go to Chris's and Bob's old neighborhoods was just like in The Wizard of Oz, where it's all really happening in your own backyard. Carter took a production research trip that began at Van Allsburg's childhood home, arriving in time to see a pretty as a postcard Christmas scene of the old neighborhood covered in a fresh snowfall. In the movie, as in the book, Chris's house inspired the design of the boys' house. In a major redefining of how to make an animated film, the traditional separation of the pre-production phase of dreaming up the look of the characters and environments and the post-production stage of final images became virtually one streamlined process. A wealth of conceptual art accumulated as the artists explored potential looks for characters, costumes, environments, and this art also served as templates for the final images. Steve Starkey described the moment that Doug Chiang presented the director with the conceptual art that opened the door for the look of the movie. When Bob saw Doug's images, he said, "If my movie could look like that, I'd be thrilled," Starkey recalled. The artwork wasn't the same tonality and texture as Van Allsburg's paintings, but it evoked the emotional feeling of the book. That was the biggest hurdle, to make that leap from the art form of the book into cinema. When the rights were acquired to the book, one of the conditions that Chris Van Allsburg put on the sale of the rights to the movie was that he didn't want it to be an animated cartoon, as he feared that this would not accurately represent his characters. So Sony Pictures Imageworks presented Zemeckis with 3 options for how to make the movie. One had actors performing in costume against blue screen backing. That neutral background would then be replaced with fully computer-generated environments. Another idea was to stage a conventional live-action production with actors in real sets, scan the resulting footage into the computer, and digitally texture the images for a painted storybook effect. Zemeckis, however, felt that a live-action version was unfeasible, claiming that it would look awful and it would be impossible. It would cost $1 billion instead of $160 million. Zemeckis felt that such a version would rob the audience of the art style of the book, which he felt was so much a part of the emotion of the story. He also agreed that a conventional animated version would suit the film poorly. The third and ultimately best option for Zemeckis' consideration was saved for last: performance capture. The decision to film in performance capture, however, necessitated another studio to co-produce, as the process was expensive and cost $1 million per minute of footage. After Universal Studios turned down the opportunity, investor Steve Bing agreed to finance half of the film's budget through his company Shangri-La Entertainment, which had only produced one other film. 3 special performance capture stages were set up at Culver Studios for testing in July of 2002. It was also in July 2002 that Warner Brothers approached the new owners of the Pierre Marquette 1225, the Steam Railroading Institute, to study the engine. They allowed the art department to measure and photograph the train and allowed them to use the 1225's blueprints to model it for the movie. And visual effects art director Marty Klein, a train buff, supplied additional reference of piston function and locomotive details. The sounds of the engine chuffing in the movie were also taken from recordings of the 1225 operating under steam. In real life, the locomotive does make chugging sounds that sound sort of identical to the sound effects that were recorded by the crew at Skywalker Sound, but not entirely identical. So in order for the locomotive to make the heavy chugging sounds you hear in the movie, it hauled 12 hopper cars that were fully loaded with sand to ensure that it would make some sort of bigger than real sounds that the sound crews could use during post-production. It was also in 2002 that the voice actors were cast and probably started recording their lines. As according to Jolene Renee, the voice actress for the girl with the blonde hair and the green pajamas, in 2002 I was asked to audition for Polar Express because of my athletic background and I could do kids' voices. Additionally, according to Steve Starkey, when Michael Jeter came in for a casting call, he performed both the characters as Smokey and Steamer. Bob was so excited excited that he cast Michael for both roles on the spot. The script for the storyboard of the movie was recorded in May 2002, but the final recordings must have come later in the year, because as the movie was having its lines recorded from the actors, they unfortunately ran into a problem. Michael Jeter very sadly passed away on March 30th, 2003 before he could complete his voiceover work. To save the film, Andre Suglioso was brought in to record the remaining dialogue, as well as redub most of Jeter's already recorded dialogue, except for Steamer during the caribou scene. It was also in mid-2003 that Zemeckis brought film composer Alan Silvestri, who was his longtime collaborator, on board to compose the movie's soundtrack. According to Silvestri, when I heard that he was looking for a substantial song involvement in the movie, I immediately called my pal Glenn Ballard, who I had been looking for the right project to team up with, and this seemed like a great one. The two sat down with Zemeckis that year and talked about where he was headed with the story. Silvestri said that they were talking about ideas of what might be possible song placements that would have some kind of narrative value in the film, and not just be a dropped-in song. We went through that process through the whole making of the film. Like any kind of musical situation, at some point the material has to be ready before shooting, or in this case, motion capturing. Unlike the normal scoring curve, where basically the film is made and then you get to look at it and react to it after the fact, for this we had to have songs that were written, approved, and rendered in some form so they could make the movie to them. So it was a long curve for music in this particular case. Now, let's get back to talking about the performance capture. The technology for the performance capture stripped the process down to bare essentials. Joanna Johnston's costumes would be scanned into the computer and worn by the digital incarnation of the actors, so the performers only had to wear special motion capture suits. Each suit was marked with reflective front projection balls that served to bounce back infrared light shooting out from each of some of the 80 cameras attached to computers recording every bit of motion data. There were no elaborate physical sets to build, only basic shapes for key set pieces and props. There were no lights to rig, as the actual cinematography would come later in the computer. The breakthrough for the Polar Express was the integration of body capture and close-up capture. The latter allowed for motion cameras to record every nuance of facial expression through some 150 dot-like bits of front projection material the performers wore on their faces. The resulting data for body and facial movements, which looked like a mass of points moving in the virtual space of the computer, could be synced together and then digitally applied to corresponding points on Sony's 3D computer-generated character models, with Sony's character designer Vladimir Todorov leading the digital design effort. Since performance data could be scaled, every detail of Tom Hanks' performance as a young boy could correspond to the computer-generated character models that Sony created. The only two characters in the film to not be animated through motion capture were Smokey and Steamer, mainly because of the huge size discrepancy in their more caricatured nature compared to the rest of the cast. Ultimately, the characters were animated traditionally with skeletal animation rigs. Principal photography of the performance capture sequences began in June 2003 and concluded in May 2004. After they finished recording the performance capture sequences, the skin was added to the models, and the movie went into the second phase of production, which was essentially directing where the cameras were going to be put and how elaborate the scene was going to be. This phase was referred to by the crew as the Michelin Man phase. Robert Zemeckis describes it in further detail.
We start with this thing we call Michelin Man. That's what we basically use to lay out the shots, lay out the camera shots. The reason we use that is because they're such rudimentary computer graphic images that they don't slow the computers down with a lot of detail, so you can get that information in and out of the computers with a much faster speed.
It was during this time that a musical number titled It Takes Two, featuring Smokey and Steamer, the engineer and fireman of the Polar Express, was cut from the movie. According to Jack Rapke, one of the executive producers of the movie, it was extremely difficult to lose this scene because both characters were played so brilliantly by Michael Jeter, but after cutting many versions of the sequence, the story flowed better without the song. We'll come back to that in a bit, but for now, let's continue talking about the production. At some point after the Michelin Man phase was finished, the tapes were sent over to Alan Silvestri and the score was recorded. As for the crew, after they finished the Michelin Man phase, they then moved on to the hair and wardrobe phases, and it turns out that the digital hair and its movement were the two most difficult phases of the production of the Polar Express. First, they had to get the shape right, then they had to figure out how the hair moved when the wind was blowing through it. So the hair crew got to work, and designed every piece of hair in the movie, put it on each character, and then scanned it into the computer. After this phase finished, they then moved on to the wardrobe phase. The creation of the wardrobe was all done in the foundation of live-action cinema brought into the computer, according to Steve Starkey. They had over 30 costumes to make for all the characters in the Polar Express. So Joanna Johnston, the costume designer, put a costume on every character one time on one day. They put the entire costume on the actors, so when they dressed Tom Hanks up as Santa Claus, they gave him the full hair, the beard, the makeup, and everything. And according to Robert Zemeckis, he wore it for 15 minutes. They cyber-scanned Tom wearing the costume into the computer and mapped the costumes onto the characters. The actual movement of the clothes, however, was handled by the effects animators. The computer would then register that information, and when it went through those movements during the course of the film, it would draw on those movements to create real dynamics like in real life. After all of these phases finished, and after shots were turned over to ImageWorks for detailed CG work, fine integration was done. First, it went back to integration, and all the high-res mocap data was applied to the character models. In a regular animated film, all of the props would be created from scratch. The Polar Express had all the traditional departments of a feature film, as all of the set designs and props were meticulously scanned into the digital domain, adjusted and set into the virtual scene as if dressing a real set. Putting the Polar Express together over a 2.5-year production cycle took the talents of 319 artists and production people. The Polar Express premiered at the 40th Chicago International Film Festival on October 21st, 2004. It opened in theaters on November 7th and went into wide distribution on November 10th. In addition to the standard theatrical 35mm format, a 3D version for IMAX was also released, generated from the same CGI digital models used for the 2D version, with this film being the first full-length feature film ever converted into IMAX 3D. Phew! That was a lot of information. Now, let's get into why the movie was such a great one in the first place. First of all, this film was revolutionary for its time, being the first fully animated movie to use 100% motion capture animation, and because of this movie, it inspired several others to use the same technique, like The Adventures of Tintin, the Avatar movies, and Monster House. And I'm just going to say this right now, but the motion capture in this movie isn't bad at all. A lot of people tend to criticize the motion capture in this movie specifically, calling it lifeless and even coining a term known as uncanny valley to describe it. I disagree with this. This is the first movie to use motion capture in its entirety, so of course features like the eyes won't be perfect in this movie since they didn't have the technology to animate them in a realistic looking way yet. They had to animate the eyes by hand and use reference footage to go off of, meaning that they could have missed the darts that a real person's eyes are always doing. I mean, motion capture has significantly improved since 2004. Just take a look at the animation in Avatar. The eyes certainly don't look dead in that movie, since they actually had the technology to animate them in a realistic looking way. So I'm able to give this movie some slack for the motion capture not being up to today's standards of animation, since this was the first movie that fully used it in its entirety. The animation in this movie is incredible, with the really dark but cozy looking lighting at the beginning of the movie, but once the train reaches the North Pole, the Christmas colors really start to show. Honestly, I'd say that the lighting makes up for the quote-unquote poor motion capture that this movie has. I also like how clever the lighting is in scenes. Like, for example, when the train pulls up to the Lonely Boy's house, the lighting is dark and grim, and it looks as if even the house itself is sad. But later on, when the train returns back to the Lonely Boy's house after he learns that Christmas can work out for him, the lighting is much brighter and the house looks much more cheerful. It's a really clever way to show the Lonely Boy's character arc to the audience without exactly telling. Speaking of character arcs, I should point out that this movie manages to fit 3 of them into this movie. Let's start with the main one and talk about Hero Boy's character arc. So of course, the movie starts out with the Hero Boy not believing in Santa, even going so far as to share his doubts with his sister. He of course later on denies the conductor's offer to climb on board the Polar Express, unlike the book, since he doesn't believe in Santa, but his curiosity ends up getting the better of him in the end and he jumps on board at the last minute. He's of course still skeptical about the train going to the North Pole, but his skepticism is thrown out the window when the conductor asks him for his ticket. I'd say this is the first moment in which Hero Boy starts to believe. He definitely knew that there wasn't a ticket in his pocket second before he got on the train, his shocked face when he pulls it out giving that away. I love how subtly this is shown to the audience. There's no dialogue in this scene, the conductor doesn't comment on the fact that he pulled a ticket out of his pocket that wasn't in there before. It's totally left up to the audience to make their own conclusions on what's happening. After this, Hero Boy's character definitely goes through a change. As before, he shared his doubts about Santa with others he knew, like his sister for example, but later, he stops the train so that the lonely boy can get on it to see Santa, and put himself in danger to bring the ticket to Hero Girl so that she wouldn't get kicked off the train. And he did this so that she could see Santa too. In these scenes, he starts to become a character who wants others to see Santa instead of making others disbelieve in Santa with his doubts about him. He even has a little arc with the hobo, who was really the only antagonist in this film, I can say. He shares with the hobo that he wants to believe in Santa, but he knows that others will deceive him, which is confirmed by the hobo. This is interesting, as this confirms that the hero boy never believed in Santa, even when his parents might have first told him about him. The hobo tells him that seeing is believing, and this next scene is the point where I believe that the hobo is the antagonist of this story. The hero boy asks him about the train, and if they're really going to the North Pole. Granted, this is the same question that he asked the hero girl earlier, but I feel there's more weight to the question here since he's talking to an adult, someone who he knows he can trust since he revealed the information that he never believed to the hobo. I have a feeling that Hero Boy thought that the hero girl was trying to deceive him at first, but then he changed his tune a bit when he found the ticket he needed to ride had mysteriously appeared in his pocket with no explanation. Since he's talking to an adult he knows he can trust, he asks the hobo if this is all just a dream. The hobo never confirms this though, which leads to Hero Boy trying to wake himself up. This is why I think that the hobo is the antagonist, since he led the Hero Boy to believe that this isn't really happening. Yes, that's more of the Hero Boy's fault for misinterpreting what the hobo was saying, but the hobo was the one who never really confirmed that he was in fact dreaming, which led him to throw his belief out the window for a bit. The hobo then leads Hero Boy to the front of the train so that he can return the ticket to the hero girl, and this is where the seeing is believing arc starts to come into play. Before they return the ticket, the hobo asks the hero boy if he believes in ghosts, and the hero boy responds back with a shake of his head. This disbelief in ghosts is later disproven when the train approaches the flat top tunnel, and the hobo disappears into the air. The hero boy of course saw the hobo, yet he didn't believe in ghosts, which cements that seeing something as outlandish as a ghost is in fact believing that such a paranormal entity exists. It's also noteworthy that after the hobo leaves for the front of the train without the hero boy is when the hero boy tries to wake himself up. He's doing this because he doesn't believe that this is happening, which in turn causes him to not see the hobo until after he suspends his disbelief and realizes that he's not dreaming. This arc is again brought up by the conductor when he shares a story with the hero boy and hero girl about his first Christmas Eve run on the Polar Express. He shares with them that he was up on the roof of the engine making his rounds when he slipped and fell, but something saved him. He said that he never saw what the something looked like, and that seeing is believing. But he also says something that the hobo didn't mention. The most real things in the world are the things you can't see. Again, seeing is believing is something that was said earlier in the movie, but I again feel like it has more weight here since it's coming from an actual trustworthy source. At no point in the film does the conductor try to lead the hero boy down a path of deception. He's just a regular train conductor doing his job like he should be. The hobo, as I mentioned earlier, never clarified that this was all a dream, which led hero boy to question his belief, so he isn't the most trustworthy source. He even later tries to scare hero boy with a Scrooge puppet telling him that he's a doubter. Once Hero Boy realizes that the hobo is the one who is trying to lead him down the path of deception, he runs away from him in the puppet car and back into the safety of the regular passenger cars. Once they reach the North Pole, the observation car breaks away from the rest of the train and ends up inside the workshop, where Hero Boy, Hero Girl, and the Lonely Boy have to find their way back to North Pole Square before Santa arrives. Since Hero Boy still doesn't believe that Santa exists even though they're at the North Pole, he can't hear the bell ringing in the workshop or when the reindeer arrive to get hooked up to the sleigh while the other children can. Once Santa does arrive, Hero Boy can't see him because the elves are blocking his way, which very subtly brings back the seeing is believing arc. Since he doesn't believe in Santa, he of course can't see him, and it's only when he says, "I believe," that he can hear the bell and finally see Santa himself. Like I said earlier, I absolutely love how this movie never directly tells what's going on and leaves it up to the audience to make their own conclusions. It definitely makes the main character's arc a lot more interesting since it can be left up to interpretation. This can also be said for the conductor's line when the hero boy asks him about his ticket, which the conductor had punched "believe in." The conductor tells him, "It's nothing I need to know." It's never explained what he meant by this, and I'll admit that I was confused by it when I was younger, but it's something that I totally understand now. He says this because he already believes. And again, I just love how subtly they get the point across. Then you've got the Lonely Boy's character arc, which is a lot more straightforward. He reveals later when the train arrives at the North Pole that Christmas never works out for him, which is why he stayed behind in the observation car at first. This could also be why he was hesitant to board the train at first, just like the Hero Boy. But again, like the Hero Boy, he ends up changing his mind. Some additional info about him is also revealed in the song When Christmas Comes to Town. There's two lines in the song that say,
"I guess that Santa's busy, 'cause he's never come around.
and
All the things I've heard about, but never really seen."
which was his response to Hero Girl's verse about presents. And both lines seem to imply that the Lonely Boy's family is poor and can't afford to give him presents for Christmas, yet he still believes in Santa and that he will give him what he's always wanted. When he actually sees that Santa brought a present for him when Hero Boy, Hero Girl, and himself all land in Santa's gift bag, he immediately becomes excited about what might be inside. And when he later gets his ticket punched by the conductor at the end, it says, "Depend on, rely on, and count on." The conductor of course takes this in the context of the trip and asks him if he can count on them to get him home, but I feel that there's a deeper meaning here. He said that Christmas never works out for him and that he's never gotten presents before, but now that he knows that Santa did get him a present, he knows that he can depend, rely, and count on him to bring him presents every year, and that Christmas can work out for him, as I mentioned earlier. The last arc in the movie is the one with the know-it-all. He's of course very self-centered, caring only about his facts that he has to share with everyone else and not for other people very much. However, his perspective is completely shifted when Santa tells him to be patient, and after the conductor punches his ticket. He realizes that the world doesn't revolve around him and that his facts aren't the only thing that matters. Towards the end of the movie, it definitely feels like he's changed, accepting his mistake of misreading his ticket to the conductor, showing genuine concern for the Hero Boy when he realizes that he lost the belt from Santa's sleigh, and wishing the Lonely Boy and Hero Boy a good night when both of them have to leave the train. All in all, it's really impressive that this movie managed to fit not one, not two, but 3 character arcs into its main story being told. While we're talking about characters, let me just quickly bring up the performances of each actor and how well they did with each character. Let's start off with the man of the hour himself, Tom Hanks, who plays a plentiful amount of characters in this movie. Just how many characters does Tom Hanks play in The Polar Express? Let's count them. First off, Tom Hanks did all of the motion capture for the Hero Boy behind the scenes, so that's 1. Next up, he plays the role of the Hero Boy's father, and if you look closely, his model is pretty much just a carbon copy of Tom Hanks in animated form. That's 2. Next, we have the train conductor. Tom does both the motion capture and the voice for him, and that's 3. He also does the voice and motion capture for the hobo, and that's 4. The hobo is also the one who controls the Scrooge puppet later in the movie, and sure enough in the credits, Scrooge is listed as a character that Tom Hanks played, referring to the puppet even though the puppet isn't really its own character. Still, this counts, so that's 5. Next we have Santa himself, and Tom Hanks again both did the voice for him and provided all of the motion capture behind the scenes, so that's 6. And last but certainly not least, he of course narrates the story in the past tense, talking as the Hero Boy from the future after the events of the story have concluded. And that is 7. 7 total characters. That is A lot. Realistically though, this just goes to show how versatile Tom Hanks can be, and he did a great job playing all 7 of his characters. Hero Boy's sister Sarah and the Hero Boy's mother are both played in this movie by Leslie Zemeckis, Robert Zemeckis' wife, and she does a pretty good job, especially in her motherly role. Eddie Deason plays the know-it-all, and I think he fits the role perfectly. His voice and character are both the perfect representation of the nerd emoji in my opinion. Nona Gay also does a really great job as the hero girl, and her voice definitely fits the character very well. Jimmy Bennett does the voiceover for the lonely boy, and his timid sounding voice definitely helps hammer home the character's social awkwardness and always wanting to be alone by himself. He's definitely a very relatable character. Well, that's all of the main characters, and I really don't want to go into detail of every single background character's voice actor, as that'll make this video run longer than it already is, so we'll skip over them. The main characters' actors, however, all do a great job with their respective roles, and were definitely great casting choices for these characters, and they all have the perfect voices that were needed to tell the story. Speaking of the story, let's talk about that a bit. The story in the original book is definitely more relaxed, going for a more calmer vibe, while the story in the movie is more complex, and has obstacles that need to be conquered, like the ice lake and the roller coaster sequence in Glacier Gulch. Now, some people have criticized the movie for this, saying that this was all just a cheap way to pad the runtime. And yes, while these scenes could technically be cut from the movie and nothing of substance really be lost, I feel like they add a lot of action that the original book didn't have, and a lot of these scenes that seem like they might be pointless add a lot to the plot and give us a little bit more information about these characters that we don't really know much about. I love how the story never stops at any point. There's never really any point where it feels like the movie is dragging. Every scene has a purpose, whether to introduce the audience to characters or to show just how beautiful some of these locations this giant steam engine passes through are. The story was written in a way where these extra scenes add more to what the original book gave us and make it a lot more interesting, as I bet you that if the movie just did a one-to-one retelling of the book, people would probably still criticize it for not having enough action. Speaking of adding more to the original story, let's talk about the hobo a bit now. We did discuss him earlier and how he is the closest thing to an antagonist in this movie, but this movie also explains his backstory in a deleted scene that didn't make the final cut that I mentioned earlier when talking about the production. The story goes that the hobo decided to hitch a ride on the train on the night before Christmas. All seems to go well until the train approaches Flat Top Tunnel. He got so nervous about it that he didn't have any time to react, and he got knocked right off the train. This backstory as to how exactly the hobo passed away is interesting and all, and definitely provides some more information about a character that we don't really know about, but in the end, I'm glad that it got cut, as I feel that the song that Smokey and Steamer sing, plus the cartoony nature that they have, would have contrasted the movie's darker tone greatly. Speaking of tone, let's talk about that. The tone of the original book story went for this magical, laid-back adventure to see Santa Claus, and thus was pretty lighthearted. The movie, however, changed this and gave the original story a darker tone in several places, and I think that this was a very clever decision. There's a lot of scenes in this movie that don't play down to kids, and have pretty impacting imagery and score that helps define the situation occurring, and I love how they managed to give this simple story about riding a train to the North Pole to see Santa Claus this eerie vibe in places. At the same time, I also love that this movie managed to capture the feeling and joy of Christmas without having that standard generic Hallmark feeling. The Christmas spirit is present in all elements of this movie. In the morning sequence where the kids open their presents on Christmas morning, and when Santa appears himself. They handled these sequences very well, with Santa having this glow around him when he appears and the music becoming all somber to really nail the feeling that he is the kind of person who should be treated with reverence. And the Christmas sequences at the end having this glow to them that captures what the feeling of waking up on Christmas morning is like. It just has this magical feeling to it, and Alan Silvestri's incredible score definitely helps make these scenes feel a lot more impactful. Speaking of Silvestri, let's talk about him. The music that he did for this movie is incredible. incredible, and is honestly some of the best music that I've heard from him. He gives the music this magical and almost eerie feeling at times, and then sometimes the music will just kick into full serious mode. The range that he has in this movie is incredible, and he definitely somehow managed to capture the Christmas spirit perfectly in musical form. The songs themselves are also jams. Hot Chocolate is this really fun and upbeat song that everyone remembers from this movie. When Christmas Comes to Town is this really nice and beautiful duet piece between the hero girl and the lonely boy. The song about the train itself, aptly called The Polar Express, is also a really catchy song. Spirit of the Season, which is only sung by the elves in this movie, is also a pretty good song. Rockin' on Top of the World is this really jamming and fun song, and I just can't believe that they got freaking Steven Tyler from Aerosmith to sing this song, and Believe is quite possibly the best song in this entire movie. Josh Groban does an outstanding job singing in this song, and his voice definitely complements the slower and more calmer vibe that this song at the end is going for. Overall, the songs in the soundtrack in this movie are a 10 out of 10, and definitely help make the movie a lot more memorable than it already is. Anyways, that's really all that I have to talk about regarding this movie itself. However, there is one last thing to mention regarding this movie, and I saved the best for last. Now it's time to talk about the elephant in the room, the planned sequel to The Polar Express. Earlier this year in January, 19 years after the release of the first movie, it was revealed by producer Gary Goetzman in an interview, who had teamed up with Tom Hanks before in the past for several successful projects, that one of their next endeavors might be revisiting their 2004 Christmas movie. According to Goetzman, it is a project that they have their sights on and are trying to get moving despite potential obstacles. However, it is unclear how far along the project is or if it has any chance of being greenlit. While Goetzman has revealed this effort to get the Polar Express back on the tracks, Hanks and Zemeckis have never commented on the prospect. I personally think that making a sequel to The Polar Express is a terrible idea. I mean, both the original book and the movie wrapped up nicely at the end and were very conclusive. Where would a sequel go that wouldn't be treading ground that they've already covered before? Additionally, wouldn't you have to get permission from Chris Van Allsburg, the original author, to get a sequel made? I don't know about you, but I don't think that he'd find that idea all that appealing either. In fact, I'm more than certain that this is the case, because according to an interview done with Chris by Time magazine in 2017 about the sequel to Jumanji titled Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, he said, and I quote, "This is a project that was really energized not so much by my original book, but by the success and fandom of the first film. It was more like, not really even a sequel to the first film, but more I think the jargon in Hollywood is a reboot. Basically taking some of the same thematic material and then reconsidering it fairly liberally or fairly aggressively, without a clear obligation to characters from the first one or following through some story arc. That sort of thing." Going off of this interview, it definitely feels to me like he isn't very proud of the sequel considering how little involvement he had in it compared to the original movie from the 90s. I'm absolutely 100% certain that if someone were to interview him about this sequel to one of his most cherished books, he would most likely disapprove of the idea. I disapprove of this idea too, and think that if this idea does eventually come to fruition, the sequel would just be a cheap cash grab.
We've got to have money.
Anyways, that's everything that I wanted to mention regarding the movie itself, so now let's move on to the numerous Easter eggs and trivia that this movie has. We've talked about a lot of topics regarding this movie. We've talked about the real engine that was the inspiration for the train in the film. We've talked about the original book. We've discussed everything that there is to know about the movie. So now let's move on to all of the Easter eggs and trivia about this movie that you might not have noticed when watching the movie for the first time. To talk about this section, I'll let my good friend Train Lover 123 cover this part. Take it away, buddy!
Thank you. Like all movies, you can't have a movie without Easter eggs and trivia, but before we get into the good stuff, we need to address a couple of things. So let's talk about some of the inaccuracies that this movie has. First of all, let's discuss the scene where the train reaches the frozen lake. The fact that the train slides across the lake as light as a feather without instantly breaking the ice beneath it is impossible. That heavy express train pulling all those coaches must weigh hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. And the fact that the train doesn't break the ice, but the cotter pin flung out of the cab instantly causes the ice to crack at a rapid pace is beyond my understanding. I've heard of magic, but this is ridiculous. Not to mention the entire section of Glacier Gulch, which is a literal roller coaster ride with hills beyond realism. The train would have stalled and rolled backwards down the slope at incredible speed, derailing instantly. Another problem is that when the train first arrives in the town, which in real life would wake up the whole neighborhood, in the film it's almost like the neighbors are either deep sleepers or just couldn't be bothered to look outside. Talk about getting your beauty sleep. Anyway, there's also no way that the Polar Express will be able to travel from Michigan to the North Pole in a single night, especially with the numerous issues the train encounters along the way. That's really it for all of the bigger problems. However, one interesting thing, which isn't exactly an earth-shattering problem, is when the hobo guy says the following:
You don't want to be led down the Primrose Path.
This does not make any sense, as the Primrose Path is the path of ease and pleasure. He should have used the term the Garden Path, as that is the path of being deceived or tricked. This is confirmed to be a goof in the original draft of the Polar Express's script, as you can see here. The hobo's line clearly reads as, "You don't want to be bamboozled, led down the garden path." The reason why this was changed in the final movie to Primrose Path is unknown. Anyway, I think I rambled on enough about movie errors. Let's get into the juicy stuff now. Woohoo! There are of course a couple of Easter eggs that we briefly mentioned, like Fritz the dog in Hero Boy's bedroom and the poster of Babe Ruth on the wall, and other minor details. Those were nods that had also appeared in the book. So let's get into the really interesting stuff now, as the movie has its own entire separate Easter eggs to cover. Let's start our Easter egg journey by going in order of when they appeared in the film. So without further ado, let's get into it. First up, we have the scene where Hero Boy looks through a pile of magazines and newspaper clippings. The first one is a newspaper about department store Santas, which has the title, "Santa's on strike. Department store Santas walk out." The strike signs that the department store Santas are holding appear to say yes to Lone Pine Mall construction. The name of the mall is a subtle reference to the mall that appeared in Back to the Future, which is another movie that Robert Zemeckis directed. The next magazine is this one from the Saturday Evening Post, which shows a boy holding what looks to be a Santa Claus outfit with the words "The Discovery" written on the bottom. This magazine is actually a real magazine that was slightly altered in the movie so that the boy on the cover was holding an outfit that more closely resembled a Santa outfit. A really cool detail that you might have missed is that after Hero Boy jumps on the train, a gust of wind causes the snowman to wave goodbye as the train leaves, which is a nice and cute detail in the movie. Another detail is that on the journey, the train passes by the Herpelsheimer's department store, which was a real store in Grand Rapids, Michigan in the 50s. It even had a monorail that traveled around the ceiling, which is now preserved at the Grand Rapids Public Museum today. Another detail that you might have missed is that when the Hero Boy pulls the ticket out of his pocket, if you look closely, it has the number 1225 on it, which is a nice nod to the Pierre Marquette 1225, which, as we mentioned earlier, was the real inspiration for the train in the movie. Our next stop on this Easter egg journey is
11544 Edinburgh.
the home of Billy, the lonely boy. The address that the conductor calls out is actually the address of Robert Zemeckis' childhood home in Chicago. Additionally, the scene with the ticket floating around after the Hero Boy loses it is noticeably similar to the opening of Forrest Gump with the feather floating around, which Tom Hanks also starred in and Robert Zemeckis also directed. What's more, the tunnel that the train comes out of has the number 1225 on the top above the entrance of the tunnel, just like how the tickets had the number 1225 on them. Another detail you may not have noticed is Flat Top Tunnel itself, which has quite the unwelcoming appearance. It even emits smoke and flames out of its nostrils. Yikes! Yet another detail that...
My turn! Something that you guys never noticed when watching this movie is that in the scene where Hero Boy slides down the coal pile into the cab of the locomotive right after avoiding Flat Top Tunnel, the sound effect that plays when he slides down the coal into the cab was actually recorded by one of the crew members of the Steam Railroading Institute sliding down Pierre Marquette 1225's coal pile.
If you remember the movie when the little boy slides down the coal pile, that was me.
They really did get every sound effect from the real engine that they could have, huh? Are you okay?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for asking. Anyway, the next scene of interest is when Hero Boy blows the whistle and says...
I've wanted to do that my whole life!
This is yet another reference to Back to the Future, specifically Back to the Future 3, where Doc Brown says a very similar line. I wanted to do that all my life! Coincidentally enough, the train that appears in Back to the Future 3 is Sierra Railway number 3, which was the source of the Polar Express's whistle sound in the movie. That's what I call impressive. On the topic of Back to the Future, let's discuss the last reference to it in the movie. When the cotter pin is bouncing around the cab and floats around Smokey and Steamer, you may have missed this detail of a flux capacitor in the cab of the Polar Express. This is an insane detail, as this could imply that the Polar Express can time travel, but it's up for speculation, since we never see it do so in the movie itself. For this next scene, I'll let TSMU take this one. I do not like the puppet car.
Alright, so in the puppet car scene when the hobo scares Hero Boy with the Scrooge puppet, a puppet of a soldier can be seen as a part of the recycling toy program that the conductor mentions. This same puppet is seen again in the Christmas morning scene at the end of the movie, which means that it was recycled and given to the Hero Boy as a present. Really nice detail there that you might not have noticed. Another thing that's interesting about this scene is something that you guys probably don't know about. You thought that the deleted musical number with Smokey and Steamer was the only deleted scene in the movie? Well, there's actually another one here in the puppet car. According to the early draft of the movie's script that we mentioned earlier, there is an entire sequence inside the puppet car in this script where Mr. Punch Hand Puppet puts on a theatrical stage performance that the Hero Boy, the Hero Girl, and the conductor get dragged into. They recreate Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, which leads to the Mr. Punch puppet questioning Hero Boy on if he believes in Santa or not. They eventually finish up the show and head back into the passenger car where all the kids are, which leads into the Lonely Boys song. It's unclear how far along in production this deleted scene got before being cut, but it did get far enough to have 2 storyboards drawn for it. One showing a spotlight on the Hero Boy standing on the stage with all the broken toys in the audience, and the other one showing the Jackal, who was the puppet that scared Hero Boy before they decided on a Scrooge puppet, performing on the stage with him. There was also a music piece composed for it that went unused in the final movie, but was uncovered in a 2013 2-CD set of the recording sessions for the film's soundtrack by Rare Score's team. I can only assume that's what this unused song was composed for. I'm glad that they cut this out, honestly, as it comes off as too cartoonish, and it just doesn't flow with the plot, which is about the Hero Boy and his journey to finally believe in Santa. You can tell that they took some of the elements from this deleted scene and worked it into what the hobo says to the Hero Boy earlier about the train ride all being just a dream, which might have been another reason why it got cut. But anyways, let's get out of the puppet car now. It gives me the creeps too.
Yep. Let's move on to another Easter egg. So, when Santa and his reindeer arrive in the square, you might be wondering, where's Rudolph? Well, he does make a very quick appearance in the scene right after the Polar Express song. If you're quick enough to spot it, there's a statue of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in the town with a lovely glowing red light to prove it. I guess he really did go down in history, huh? Now, for by far the most earth-shattering detail this movie has to offer. Time is frozen in this movie. Don't believe me? Well, you might want to sit down for this one, folks, because you're in for a real doozy. At the beginning of the movie, the clock on the Hero Boy's table reads 11:55 p.m., or 5 minutes to midnight, with the date just starting to roll over from the 24th to the 25th. However, the clock has frozen in place with the hands no longer moving. Throughout the movie, 5 minutes to midnight is mentioned several times, and if you pay close attention during the Polar Express song, a clock tower is visible with the hands still reading 11:55 p.m. It is confirmed later that time is frozen when the know-it-all says,
It was 5 minutes till midnight 4 minutes ago.
Exactly.
It isn't until the Hero Boy is handed the bell that the clock tower chimes and finally reads 12 a.m. midnight. This is by far one of the most interesting details in the film, which also answers many questions as to why the Hero Boy's parents never heard or saw the train outside the house, among many other things. And before you freak out about the fact that his parents might have noticed the Hero Boy's disappearance, the train technically still has 6 hours to take the children home and disappear into the night before the morning sunrise.
Another interesting and funny Easter egg is that when the Hero Boy, Hero Girl, Girl and Lonely Boy arrive in the communications room in the North Pole, the elves have a brief discussion about a bad little boy in New Jersey named Steven, who terrorized his two younger sisters. This line is a nod to Robert Zemeckis' friend and mentor, Steven Spielberg. Spielberg himself grew up in New Jersey and has admitted many times that he frequently terrorized his two younger sisters when he was younger.
Well, wasn't he a little demon? Anyway, another interesting thing to know is that in the shots of the Christmas tree, if you take a closer look at the compass in the center of the square, you might notice that all points of the compass point south. This is because at the geographical North Pole, the needle of a compass would point south, as that is the only direction that a person can go from there. Another interesting detail is that the building design for the North Pole City drew inspiration from the Pullman neighborhood in Chicago, home of a railroad car manufacturer, the Pullman Company. The clock tower, which Santa comes out of, is even based on the Pullman factory clock tower. Additionally, Chris Van Allsburg mentioned that
exactly how it looked was a result of spending a fair amount of my adult life in New England, where they have a lot of old mill buildings, vast brick buildings that were made to make textiles and things like that.
What an interesting fact there, Mr. Allsburg. Now we're getting into the final details of the movie. A cool detail is when Hero Boy walks up the stairs back to his room towards the end. You can briefly see the fireplace starts to emit visible smoke, which means that Santa has started his journey. Another detail is the model train that appears at the end resembles the older Lionel models, while also having the old tubular track. The final detail in this movie is, if you look closely at the reflection of the bell, you can see Santa's face appear for a split second before the movie finally comes to a close, as well as our Easter egg journey. Please watch your step as you exit the train, and we hope you enjoyed the journey through Easter egg fields. Phew, I need some water after all that talking.
So now it's time to answer the question, why is The Polar Express the best Christmas movie in our opinion? Well, the answer is simple. The motion capture was revolutionary for the time, the animation and lighting was all very well done, the character arcs of all the characters are very well thought out and conclude nicely, the actors' performances are all impressive and fit their respective characters very well, the tone is much darker than that of the original book but at the same time manages to capture the spirit and the joys of Christmas without having that generic Hallmark feeling, and the music is beautifully composed and complements the movie greatly. The Polar Express is the best Christmas movie because it takes the original story and expands upon it greatly, adding new characters and putting a new take on a classic Christmas story for children. It encapsulates what Christmas is really all about, believing in Santa even though you can't see him, and Santa himself captures the true meaning of Christmas, giving to others and putting aside differences and arguments during the festive season. It is an unforgettable experience and has made such an impact on me that my family and I watch the movie on Christmas Eve every night before going to bed. The movie impacted me so much that my family and I even got to go on the North Pole Express ride that the Steam Railroading Institute does around Christmas time. The Polar Express is, by far, the best Christmas story that I have ever seen. And hopefully, after watching this video, you'll agree with us too.
It's a magic carpet on a rail, never takes a breath. Flying through the mountains and the snow. To ride so free, enjoy the fun. If we just say yes, then that's the way things happen on the Polar Express. For so long, that's the sun to sing. Ding, ding, bell, ring, darling, go. So I wonder if you'll get there soon. Anybody's guess, the best way things happen on the Polar Express.
And that was our review on the Polar Express. You know, when I first started working on this, I knew that this was going to be a big video project, but it's kind of crazy to me that this video is now beating out my Mario movie review as the longest review video on my channel. I mean, geez, this one broke an hour! But seriously, this video was really fun to work on, doing lots of in-depth research on the movie's production and the history of the 1225. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, then I highly recommend checking out the books Images of Rail, Pierre Marquette 1225 by T.J. Gaffney and Dean Pyers, and The Art of the Polar Express by Mark Cottavaz and Steve Starkey. Both were used as sources of information for this video, and there's a lot of additional bits of trivia and information in both of those books books that we did not mention. So go check them out if you want more details on the history of 1225 and how they made the movie. I really like them a lot. They're very enjoyable reads.
And I really enjoyed working with you on this video. The Polar Express always remains one of the greatest Christmas movies of all time, and can be enjoyed any time of the year. With its amazing story and spectacular scenes, this movie gets a solid 10 out of 10 from me. Oh, and before we forget, we want to wish all of you watching this a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year, and a Happy Hanukkah, if you celebrate it. Anyway, I must go now and spend time with my family. See ya, TSMU!
Adios, train lover. It was a pleasure to work with you on the script. You know more about trains than anyone that I've ever met, and I definitely recommend checking out his YouTube channel, which will be linked in the description below. Anyways, I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Be thankful for your friends and family on this cherished holiday. Anyways, that's really about it from me, folks. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one. This is the TSMU fan, signing out. Special thanks to my Patreon supporter, Master Painter, and I give an extra special thanks to those patrons of mine who have chosen to remain anonymous. If you'd like to learn how to get your name at the end of every new video that I upload, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Link is on my channel homepage under my channel description.